What is our favorite slot to draft in, and what, I guess, is the best draft slot for your drafts in 2024? We're going to talk about that along with a couple of other topics here, as we have a kind of a listener mailbag diving into some best ball topics that we are going to go through on today's show. Shawn, as training camp is underway and as things are moving progressively faster, there is lots of times where we'll be talking about stuff, and then by the time we record, things could have changed dramatically. One thing that's not going to change is kind of the draft slot conversation. So this will be a bit more evergreen. As we are recording this one, there's all the rumblings and stuff going on with Brandon Aiyuk, the 49ers, the Steelers. What happens? We will know. Maybe by the time we finish this show, Shawn, things will have changed to another element of the conversation. But we're going to keep it so the stuff we talk about today is still valid before we finish this recording in 30 minutes or so's time. That's the goal.
I don't know, Colm. That might be a little too high a standard to set these days. With, again, the 24-hour news cycle, the Brandon Aiyuk conversation has been fascinating here because we made a trade last night in our RotoViz OT Listener League Dynasty Startup over at the FFPC. This draft has been an absolute blast, Colm, and we've gotten some static for a few of our different selections, which I enjoy and appreciate. It's been so much fun interacting with the listeners. And one of the things that you have to do is sometimes violate your own rules when you're in a room where many of the drafters are approaching it in the same way. But we have said on the show, keep the path for yourself open. Don't give up your future first round pick if you can help it at all. We got an offer yesterday of, I believe, the 812 and the 903 for a future first. That was too fun to ignore. And then, Colm, we didn't actually talk about who we wanted to pick, though, as we were about to get on the clock. And then, it turned midnight in Ireland. You turned into a pumpkin, and I was left to my own devices.
Yeah, and we're gonna hold who the player is, because we are going to talk about this draft on the Friday edition of the show. So that's another teaser. But Shawn, I do have a fun story about overnight drafting that actually occurred last night as well. I'm drafting with Connor O'Driscoll. I know Shawn has said he has some problems with me drafting with the other members of the community that we love to draft with, and obviously that's more joking than anything. But Connor and myself were discussing Jameson Williams, and Jameson Williams may come up on today's show about the tier break at wide receiver, but it was Jameson Williams, and the player that I was kind of making the pitch for is TJ Hawkinson. We had Kyle Pitts. I'm thinking that second tight end, who could be the league winning smash play, and I was making the pitch for it. But before I went to sleep, Shawn, I put him to the top of the queue. I fell asleep, and Connor replied maybe like 5 hours later, but the pick had already been made, and the reply was that I had Shawn Siegele him. It's hard to filibuster Shawn on a 6-hour clock, but I managed to do it, and we ended up with TJ Hawkinson. So we'll see how that works out for us over the course of the season.
Colm, before we get to that, though, I do want to say that if people are interested in this TJ Hawkinson discussion, he was one of the controversial players in the rankings debate, the great Stealing Bananas rankings debate. That show is
the great debate of 2024.
That's right. Across the 3 SB shorts this week, and then if you prefer, obviously the full audio will come out as well. Jump on over there. Colm, I really want to emphasize this dynasty. You're trying to keep all of it for the Friday show.
Yeah.
Part of what we're looking at here is we have 4 more picks, even after the one I slipped in on you overnight. 4 more picks in the next 9.
5 and 13. We ended up with 5 picks and 13,
which is a lot of fun. It's into the range where it's a little bit less clear cut. So, there's a reason that we were able to acquire those picks, right? They are not quite the same level. These aren't premium picks, but they do matter. And especially in terms of how you're trying to build out the roster. And Colm, we have an interesting team where we always talk about making sure your dynasty roster is coherent and that your tactics point in the same direction. We have 2 rookie QBs and Bryce Young. We have 2 high-value, young-ish running backs. But, I mean, running backs basically only have a 1-year window regardless. In Travis Etienne and Kenneth Walker, we've got young receivers. We have Brock Bowers. But we're also going to have 17 picks in the first 11 rounds. So 17 and 11. That's sort of our biggest strategy point in terms of trying to get as many picks as possible before you really start to hit these serious tier breaks. We don't have a future first. So the folks who traded with us are going to be looking at our quarterback room all season long thinking they're not going to make it. They're not going to make it. I'm going to get this top 3, top 4 pick for next year, maybe the 101, because again, the Triflex format has the backdraw. And I would like to think if we missed the playoffs, we would be competitive in the backdraw. We'll have to see. But we do have 2 R2s and 2 R3s for the future. So just because we don't have a future first doesn't mean that we're completely bereft when it comes to these future picks. All of that is going to be fascinating. We are going to discuss, we're currently on the clock. Because we have a bunch of picks coming up in a row, we're not going to discuss the pick because we haven't decided, right? The draft is waiting for us to decide. We haven't decided. I think we have some disagreement on who we should grab next. That will lead off the Friday show because at that point, hopefully we won't give away all the information we need to make these picks coming up. But I'm really looking forward to that. We'll be recording it in 30 minutes. You can listen to it on Friday. Colm, what does the mailbag have for us?
I love the amount of build-up we've put into this Friday edition, Shawn. It's almost probably half the length of our Wednesday edition of the show, but it is going to be fun to talk through. And apologies to the people in the draft who are waiting on the pick to come in as we continue to record additional shows. But it is going to be a good show, so I'd highly recommend checking that out for some Dynasty talk. But the thing is the players that we are drafting are all basically first or second year players, the majority of them, and some of them have yet to hit at the NFL level. So, for best ball, for redraft, all these players are going to be interesting to talk through as well. But Shawn, I mentioned that we were going to start off with the draft slot, and we've talked quite a bit to start off here about, Jameson Williams and the kind of tier break at wide receiver. So I think I'm going to flip it over and we'll go with the tier break question first. It was a question that came in on YouTube, and I had noticed this popping up a few times. Is when we're doing drafts, whether it's me and you, me and Blair, me and Michael Dubner done a few, me and Kevin have done a few, yourself and Ben. I actually think this one may have come in on a Stealing Bananas draft, but the question was regarding the wide receiver tier break. So how do you feel about some variance over a large amount of best ball drafts, maybe 60-40 favoring the wide receiver at that tier break rather than taking a running back at that spot? The question specifically mentions a third running back. I have to say that when we're in drafts, Shawn, depending on how the team is set up, if you have 5 wide receivers, 1 or 2 tight ends and a quarterback through that point, you may have no running backs. And there is potential times where you have 1 or 0 running backs at that point. Usually you will have 1 to 2 at that particular spot in your draft. But when you get to that tier break, which I tend to look at as kind of between where you can take Jameson Williams and then where you get to potentially Jerry Jeudy, and they're kind of the 2 players that I'm targeting between those 2 particular spots. How do you feel about going with the running backs? And that, I guess the thing is are you afraid to miss that tier break? And do you split it up at all between, I need to get a running back here or I need to get a wide receiver? For me, at that particular point of the draft, it generally is, I know the running backs I can get from that point through the back end of the draft. And I'm much more comfortable with that than the pathway to getting what I would say in those final, 8 rounds is probably 8 wide receivers that you genuinely want, and 2 of them play for the Denver Broncos. How are you feeling about
which is risky, right? I mean,
it's quite a risky proposition, and to have high exposure to both of those is also risky.
Yeah. So my understanding of the question is that because we focus so much on getting the receiver before that wide receiver cliff or before this big tier break that there are some listeners who are thinking through how we're approaching it for ourselves, but also how they're approaching it, obviously, for themselves, and wondering if we're going to end up too wide receiver heavy and whether or not it would make sense to incorporate some of these high value running back picks and have some balance to the structures, right? For me, it's a little bit of the other direction, where even if you know that you need to get those receivers at different points of the draft, the running back options will become so tantalizing that you will select them and then you end up short at receiver.
Yeah.
And the reason I kind of mention it that way is that I think because there's so much emphasis on the ADP movement over the last couple of years, that it's reasonable to think that we're going to create an environment where some running back picks are really good selections. I don't necessarily disagree with that, in that when you look at where Kyren Williams, Travis Etienne, sometimes Derrick Henry, when you look at where a Kenneth Walker goes, there are strong possibilities that some of these guys are going to hit in a way that crushes the implied point total from ADP. And the thing that I always like to mention is that at some point we are going to get a season that is somewhat similar to 2016.
Well, it's something you're trying to talk into existence anyway.
Well, no, I mean, you have to keep that in mind.
It definitely is. It's definitely a possibility.
So much of what we tend to focus on in best ball is what happened the previous year, in part because that is the most easily accessible data for so many people. That is the year that includes the coaching and scoring trends that are most likely to be similar to the upcoming season. That is the year that ADP is going to be most similar to what you're dealing with in the upcoming season. So when you say, well, let's look back at 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, it's important to keep those seasons in mind, but they're also very problematic because NFL coaches were approaching football in a different way and fantasy managers were approaching football in a different way. So you had different scoring trends and different ADP. And so some of the conclusions you draw are simply not going to be relevant in any way, shape, or form. But we do have to remember that when we're just chasing the previous season, that these seasons are unique. We want to keep all of that in mind. That's all preface for pointing out that the research that Jake Bowes has done for us, the couple of really good articles that Michael Dubner has put out, and if you really want to get yourself ready for underdog drafts over the next month, where you're going to hammer it in this high value time period and you're going to build out a portfolio that allows you to place multiple teams in the finals and at least have a shot at that big pot, I can't recommend anything more than those two articles from Michael. The takeaway from our Underdog Roster Construction Explorer is very clear, which is that your exploitable opportunity is to push it farther than the rest of the people, not less. And so you're going out there, you're seeing all of these people drafting wide receiver heavy teams, and you're thinking, okay, well, at a certain point, that's over the top, or at a certain point, everybody's doing the same thing. How do I pivot off of that? The uncomfortable pivot is actually to take more wide receivers still. And so when we get into the situation where we're adding additional running backs, we're probably hurting our advance rates. And one of the things that our buddy Mike Leone has really continued to emphasize for people, and just trying to make sure they understand, advancing more teams is a huge deal and is going to help you more in many cases than very marginal improvements to your chance to score a lot of points in week 17. So we want to think about how do we get as many teams through as possible. And then I think you want to be thinking about, how do I create a super team? And the history of zero RB tells us so conclusively and convincingly, and it's accelerating in its being the case, if that makes sense, in the zero RB is the way to do it. And then we can hit on so many of these guys. So for me, it's actually the opposite, where I'm constantly trying to get out there and push. And, I do a lot of drafts with Pete, obviously, for the Best Ball Banana Stand. Those drafts are very difficult to get enough wide receivers. When you're working through, on your own, and you see, one of the things that we've talked a lot about, that Blair has a good article about, is elite tight end, bully tight end. We're seeing great tight end prices. The research there in the recent seasons would suggest that probably isn't the way to do it. But again, I would throw in this asterisk, which is that 2024 is not going to be exactly like the previous seasons. And one of the things that we have now are elite tight ends that you can probably count on, and multiple examples of them. If you do what the recent past would kind of suggest, which is to wait and then to try and make it work with bad tight ends, that's a little bit troubling, or it could be problematic for 2024. When we look through all of that, you come back to this original conclusion where, Colm, I've gotten in this weird mindset where I go into these best ball drafts and I want to make a lot of picks at every position early. And then you have to remind yourself, oh, wait, you only get one pick at every round, right? It was interesting when Ben and I participated in an FFPC Best Ball Tournament draft live the other night, and people can pull that up on the Stealing Bananas airwaves as well. We ended up only taking one running back in the single-digit rounds. We actually waited so long on running back that the Roster Construction Explorer does actually say, well, you guys waited too long. This probably won't work. You didn't get enough running back firepower. The issue again there, though, is like, who are you actually drafting? What are the running back profiles, and what were you able to accomplish at the other positions? Because again, we only get one pick in every round. If we don't take enough receivers, nothing else is set up properly. And so the Best Ball Tournament blueprint, the big strategy guide, I've written a couple of parts to that. That's up on the site. You can dive through what some of the ramifications and consequences are for different types of selection. But even in this FFPC format, where I think the running back picks are going to be, even more compelling, because we could play up to 4 of them in any given week. They're discounted. You can score a lot of points. It probably isn't the way to do it. I'm currently in the middle of a slow draft with Eric Hove, and we just have James Conner through 11. Now, we do know that running back is going to be potentially an issue. We're going to try and hammer that as we go forward. But, Colm, you mentioned this sort of Jerry Jeudy area. I think that the area that you're really looking at, the area that is tough, is that Jameson Williams area. So much, much earlier, right?
Oh, what I meant, sorry, was that Jameson Williams is the end of the cliff, and the next wide receiver I'm looking to draft is Jerry Jeudy. Multiple rounds. And if people heard me laughing there, the reason I laughed is that Shawn mentioned James Conner, and it feels like James Conner through 11 is like each one of my drafts through the last 3 weeks. So that hit a card with me. That's why I had the chuckle.
Well, it was funny too, because I've been saying that I think James Conner and Saquon Barkley's ADPs should probably be flipped, and that Saquon Barkley, James Conner ADP area is another one that came up. Not ADP area, but the rankings element of it that came up in our Stealing Bananas rankings debate. So that was a lot of fun. And the debate was really only in who was willing to be more aggressive in arguing with actual ADP. So when we look at that draft and what the choice is, in round 8, we're looking at JSN as the wide receiver 5, or guys like Zamir White, Jonathan Brooks, Chase Brown, Javonte Williams as the running back 2. Are there scenarios in which those guys outscore JSN straight up? Obviously. But when we think about how those players are going to work and what elements of the profile are more replaceable later and what it does for us structurally. I mean, it's a very easy pick for us. That doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be right. But the evidence for the players involved in terms of the profiles, and then the evidence historically with the structures, makes it a very simple decision. You work back through and you hope that Chase Brown or Javonte Williams come back to us. They don't. They go one pick ahead of us, which actually allows us to get a stacked QB, which was another strong priority. So it's not like you're getting into rounds 8, 9, 10 and don't have difficult decisions where the trade-offs are significant. Because if a running back gets back to us, we take that running back and we let the quarterback pass, then we're going to have a hard time building out the QB wide receiver combination element. And I think that's the fun part, right? Is that, I mean, for so many people, redraft is still going to be the thing. I've got some redraft articles coming out. I'm so fired up about redraft season coming. I do think that when we look at best ball, one of the things that pulls you in and keeps you captivated, even after you've done, tens of teams, or in some people's cases, hundreds of teams. I'm sure we have a listener or two out there who's done thousands of teams. Trying to make those 8, 9, 10 types of picks with all of the trade-offs in play, that's a super fun element of it.
It's one of the most fun and one of the most interesting parts strategically. I do feel like if you do a draft, and let's say you are drafting a multitude of drafts, so you have ways to try out what you're doing. But in the drafts where you do go with a running back there, I feel like when it comes to round 18 or round 20 and you look at your whole draft as it's played out, I do think the majority of times you feel like, I wish I had gone with the wide receiver there. The other thing to note on that, Shawn, is you mentioned James Conner, and I mentioned him as well. But James Conner and Kenneth Walker, they are two players who I am willing to make a move for at the running back position in drafts at the moment. They're both, in the FFPC and the Superflex regular tournament going in the 6th round as running back 17, running back 19. But you mentioned having him and then looking at those guys as your running back 2. I think when you have one running back through those opening 8 rounds, I think it's even more important to get that additional wide receiver on the roster as well. But when you're looking at the ADP charts, from that round 9 onwards all the way through round 14, I think the majority of the best picks in those rounds are leaning towards either quarterback or running back. And I think that you really want, it's the same as well with the tight ends. You mentioned Blair's work on the 2 tight ends. I'm trying to have 2 tight ends a lot of the time through those opening 8. And that just means that you either have 0 running backs, but if you have a running back, that's 3 non-wide receiver spots. And then if you add in a quarterback, like, you really need to be making sure you have the wide receiver firepower. Because if you're playing in one of the contests we did a lot of drafts, Shawn, that we've talked about is the Superflex contest. And we've talked about the additional kind of advantage of having running backs in that format. But when you're looking at the best ball tournament, it's not Superflex, the $125 version over at the FFPC, or if you're playing in Best Ball Mania, you really need to have those additional wide receivers to fill out the additional non-Superflex spot in that particular format. So I think there's far more chance that you get to the end of the draft and you feel like you don't have enough. And one of the final kind of things I would talk through is, zero RB obviously is something, Shawn, that we've been talking about on this show, and you wrote about, over 10 years ago, a decade of it at this point, and it's obviously growing in popularity and usage and adaptability over the last couple of years, and people are implementing it. But I still do think that a lot of people who are doing it are not doing it to the principles that that we talk about or you set out in terms of how to successfully build that roster and the roster construction of it. And part of that is, I think, if people have, say, 4 wide receivers through their opening 6 rounds, I think they think that I have enough wide receivers, and that's the point now where I can pivot to looking at my running backs or looking at the other positions. But like you mentioned, as more and more people have adapted it, the way to take advantage of that is to keep pushing it. And I remember a few years ago, we did a show with Peter Overzet, and one of his things was about, being comfortable in that kind of uncomfortable situation. And I feel like now, if you're comfortable at 0 RB drafts, that uncomfortable situation is taking that additional wide receiver, at that point of the drafts, because you may feel like, I really need a running back here, but what you really need is that additional wide receiver, I think.
And everything kind of within its context and within the proper degree, because the element that you talk about pushing it is something that you really want to do, but then you also have to know when to stop. And so one of the things that I think is a pretty interesting takeaway from Jake's research is that people are probably not drafting enough early wide receivers and then drafting too many. And especially again in best ball, if you want to build these heavily game stacked teams, that means you have to be extremely intentional with your picks right from the beginning. And that part of it again is fun because it encourages you to do a little pre-draft prep and work out the most likely paths, as opposed to take, say, ADP values and then try to, tie it together late. I'm not saying that that won't work. And certainly if you do enough drafts, if you are effective enough with the ADP grinding, and then you do tie the teams together, I mean, those are going to be fairly strong teams. I would suggest that's still not the final level you can get to. And so those, again, contradictory elements, or the elements that have a lot of trade-offs, are so much fun as we work through building our best ball teams.
Yeah, I think that's a fun conversation that we kind of extrapolated out longer than I had thought that we would talk about it. But there's a lot of parts that go into it. And anytime we can dive a bit deeper, I think, when questions like that come in, there may be people who are newer listeners to the show, maybe coming in now after maybe having some time off from listening to fantasy football podcasts in the off season. And I think it's a good kind of catch up and reminder of, some of the strategic elements of building out those rosters. We did mention Shawn at the top, and I think it feeds into what we've talked about now is our favorite roster spot, or our favorite draft slot. There's two ways this question has come in. One has come in just in general, just is there a league where, if you can pick, a particular listener has the fourth choice. I like this in my home league. We do some different off-season competitions, and that leads to who gets, the first, second, third slot and a redraft. We do a dynasty and a redraft, but I don't know how this guy has got his selection, but he is the fourth choice. And the other question, Shawn, of a similar variety, come in about, FFPC and NFFC 12-team PPRs. But one of the things it did mention is if there's a league where it has a third round reversal. So for people in the Scott Fish Bowl, they'd be familiar with the third round reversal, but it is in some different formats as well. So we'll talk first about the general, but I think, Shawn, this year, that range of 5 through 7 is my preferred option. And the reason for that is you have a chance of getting some of those guys in the top tier to fall to you, and then you get the earlier pick in the second round, rather than if you're picking at the 1, 2, or the 1 or 2, you're obviously waiting a little bit longer, and it's less likely for some of those values of the players that we're targeting to come true. Interestingly enough, I mentioned drafting with Connor O'Driscoll. Shawn, I'm on a hot streak. If you're looking to get an early draft slot, we need to get some draft set up. I got the 102 in both of the drafts with Connor, and I got the 103 in a draft that we kicked off with Zachary Kruger. So I've been on a good draft slot run here recently, but I do prefer the kind of 5 through 7, because what I find in those drafts is the second player you kind of want tends to be going that little bit earlier. But the other part is, if you want to get CD Lamb, you have to have the first or second pick of those drafts. So that would be my preference when we're looking at the standard format. And I think in the third round reversal, I would set it the same. And the reason for that is you're going to get the same kind of pick in the third round versus if you're at either end. And I do feel like picking at either end has been a challenge as well in drafts, because the way that the draft just flows, the sweet spot for me is kind of that 5 or 7 spot. Have you a different preference this year, or how are you feeling your drafts?
Well, we had this question come in from the perspective of best ball, from the perspective of redraft, as you mentioned, also with this other layer of potentially third round reversal. I do think it's interesting when you look at just how unlucky the very early picks have been. So you can pull up the Best Ball Win Rate Explorer or the Underdog Advanced Rate Explorer, and you see that the early picks have been catastrophic.
Crushing.
The reason for that is that all of those guys have gotten hurt. And
I had seen conversation yesterday, Shawn, when the news came out about Christian McCaffrey having a little bit of a niggle. It's the 101 has kind of struck again.
Yeah, I don't
just wrap CD Lamb in cotton wool, please.
Right, exactly. And then as you kind of work through it, some of the things that you're seeing are a bump for the picks in the middle, but then there's also potentially this bump for the picks at the end. And we have to understand why that is the case. And basically what is happening is that if you are getting anything other than a running back who massively hits, you're losing. The picks in that sort of 10, 11, 12 range have been successful in part and almost exclusively because some of the wide receivers you were able to draft there, like a Tyreek Hill, a CeeDee Lamb, a Devontae Adams,
Amon-Ra,
a Stephon Diggs, right? And then last year, Amon-Ra, those receivers have scored incredibly well. So if you put a couple of them together, if you're in a league where they wrap into round 2 and you have both of them, you're off to the races. I think when we're looking at 2024, we want to understand the specific sort of ADP ramifications or the specific player ramifications. So from this perspective of drafters are being a little bit more restrained in going after the running backs, and then when we're looking at the wide receivers in this range, there is some reason to be nervous. Now, as this show comes out, I'm going to have my favorite pick for people who have a bad draft slot. And I do think that there is a way to play those bad draft slots into an epic season. One of the things that was kind of interesting, and it's certainly fun, it makes you feel good about the work that you've done, is that as I kind of worked back through the last 4 seasons, our bad draft slot articles and teams, including the one that I did with you in the main event just last year, have been extremely successful. Again, you have to keep that in the context of one of the reasons that has been the case is that drafts have given us star wide receivers at the 1-2 turn. And so it hasn't been that hard, really. I don't know that that is the case this year. And certainly with the Puka injury, thinning it out even a little bit more, you're going to be sort of nervous. And so what I would say is that the data suggests, and there are certainly tactical reasons within the draft, that having a middle pick is going to allow you to get into that top tier in the first round, which could be very helpful. It's going to potentially allow you to get in ahead of a tier break in the second round. And then as you go through the draft, you are less likely to be the victim of runs. And so when you're out there on the edges and you're trying to make a selection and you don't know who's going to go in the ensuing, 20 some picks, you have pressure to address positional concerns that you don't have as much in the middle. And that will sometimes lead to a weaker draft because you're operating with so little information in a key way that you miss on picks. And I say miss on picks, you just make a pick that ends up being suboptimal, or you make a riskier pick, and sometimes those things end up cascading on you a little bit.
You do also at the edges have to, I think what you're kind of hinting at is there's times where you're going to have to reach for players. So, one of Shawn's favorite targets this year is Brock Bowers. But, if you're picking and he's going to go in those next 20 picks, but you need that tight end or you want to get him on your roster, there's times where you're going to have to make that move. And the other thing with the center picks, something that we talk about a lot, Shawn, when we do our recorded drafts, is trying to push a quarterback around a turn, or push a tight end or even a running back around a turn if you're trying to see if you can get, let's say, Jalen Warren or a Chase Brown to work their way back to you. When you're at the turns, like at the corner, at the 1 pick or the 2 pick, that's very hard to do. If you're at the 8, maybe you can kind of pitch out, well, in the next 8 picks, there's a chance that player gets back. It's not possible to say that they're definitely going to get back those kind of 20 picks to get back to you as well. So I think just managing it, and also it helps you sometimes get those players that maybe fall 6 or 8 picks past ADP at the quarterback position, for example, or the running back position, whereas again, you do miss out on a lot of those opportunities at those turns as well. And
just to sort of wrap this up with an example and a little shout out to our good friend Mike Brody, currently in the Apex Experts League with, it's just such a fun league because you look at the folks and they're all superstars. Having the 107 has been extremely valuable because it's basically, And one of the things that happened here is that Justin Jefferson went at the 105. It'll be interesting to see if that ends up being the right choice. Certainly Jefferson could have like a 32, 33, 34% target share, in which case the level of his quarterback play with the level of his talent, probably, it matters less, right? If you're going to have that massive target volume. So I could certainly see that working. In some cases, you're going to have him like after the tier break. But again, being in the middle allows you to take advantage of some guys who might slide in your draft that don't generally. I was able to get Bijan Robinson in the first. Then when it comes back in the second, I get to have this interesting choice between Cooper Kupp and Drake London. And then when it comes back in the third, Kyron Williams has fallen to that spot. And so you can either take what would presumably be a pretty significant value there, or you can still make your choice of Zay Flowers, Tank Dell, and execute what you want to do structurally. When you're a little bit more out on the edges, harder to take advantage of those values, and you get pushed a little more on structure as opposed to getting to define it for yourself.
I think that's all very well said. But that is going to do it for this edition of RotoViz OT. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening in. Those topics come in as suggestions from some of the RotoViz Overtime community. So if you are interested in having a topic or a discussion heard on the show, send them in. You can leave a comment on YouTube. You can tweet it my way at Overtime Ireland, or you can email it across at rotovizradio@gmail.com. We'll try and get some of those in over the course of the next few weeks before the NFL season. We did tease it at the start of the show. We will be back on Friday for that Dynasty conversation with, as I mentioned, a lot of young players that we are drafting. See why we are drafting them, and does that mean you should be drafting them across all formats on that edition. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.